This is the first of our lectures on bone tissue. Our learning objectives, number one, are to know and understand the functions of bone. Number two, we want to distinguish between this thing called the axial skeleton versus the appendicular skeleton. And then we want to talk about different types of bone that we see down here. Now you'll notice that there's two learning objectives talking about bone types. Well, that's because the learning objective number three, what are the different types of bone based on shape? Meaning that we categorize bone based on their shape. But number four, what are the different types of bone based on their architecture, which is just a different system that we use to categorize bone. Okay, so let's start with the functions of bone. The functions of bone, probably the most famous one is for protection, and I think this we're well aware of. Obviously, the skull is up here, and the brain, it's going to protect the brain. If you were to knock yourself on the forehead, thank goodness your skull is there, otherwise you would give yourself a concussion. So it serves as protection. The rib cage also, of course, is going to provide very important protection to the things in the thoracic cavity and maybe the upper part of the abdominal cavity. The vertebral column is going to protect the spinal cord, etc. The second function, and this is actually really important, and this is something we can't forget, is mineral storage. So mineral storage, acid-base homeostasis, but we're going to focus on mineral storage, and primarily that is calcium. We want to think of the bones as being a storage of calcium. It's a reservoir for calcium. What we're going to start to see now in the course is we're going to see that calcium is really important for a lot of different things. You need calciums for muscles to work, for your heart to work, for your blood to clot. It's really, really critical. And it's so important that we always need a constant supply of calcium at our ready. So certainly there's dietary calcium, but we want to know that your bones themselves store calcium. So right off the bat, that might sound a little bit funny because you may have heard, well, calcium is what makes bones strong. And when you don't have enough calcium, your bones get weak and brittle. And that's absolutely correct. But functionally, we can think of this as a reservoir for calcium because we will unapologetically take calcium out from the bones to dump it into the blood so that other organs have ready access to them. And a lot more of that is to come, not just in Bio 141, but in the next semester as well. Bones themselves, another function, is they're responsible for blood cell formation. So you guys will cover blood in another course, but blood cells themselves, namely red blood cells and white blood cells, those things are actually born in the bone. There's some fat storage that also occurs right over here. So yellow bone marrow stores triglycerides, and we're going to find these in medullary cavities of long bones. This one over here, I'm not sure that I completely like the way this is listed. True or false, the bones create movement or are responsible for movement. No, they're not. It's the muscles themselves that create movement. And it says it here, muscles produce body movement. But how do they do that? They do that through attaching to bones. So it's clear, we need to be clear that bones themselves cannot move anything. There's no contractile element to them. There's no muscle-like feature to them. Muscles are the ones that do that, but they happen to attach to bones. Not in all cases, but in most cases with the case of skeletal muscles. And then lastly, support. So the skeleton itself, as you can see here, supports the weight of the entire body. And so these are the general functions then of bone. Okay, next learning objective then is to look at the difference between the axial and appendicular skeleton. Well, as you know, this is the unit where we cover the different bones. And you're going to learn things like the frontal bone, the temporal bone, the parietal bone. You'll learn about the different ribs, the humerus, radius, ulna, etc. All these things, by the end of this unit, you really need to know these bones. But what we want to do is kind of broadly group them. And what you see here, you'll see bones that are laid out in kind of this dark brown color and bones that are in that more vanilla looking color. And so everything here in that dark brown is considered to be part of the axial skeleton. And this is generally stuff in the midline. Again, this is your midline. So these are the bones of the axial skeleton. Everything else, though, on the outside, which would be the extremities, right? Everything in the lower extremity and the upper extremity, these are considered parts of the appendicular skeleton. So we just need to know those terms. And there's the key for you there. Bones of the axial skeleton and bones of the appendicular skeleton. Probably the only place that people really get tripped up with this is the clavicle right over here. The collarbone, which we'll learn is called the clavicle. And so that is part of the appendicular skeleton, as is the scapula, which is also known as the shoulder blade, but formally it is called the scapula, and that's the term we'll use. So the clavicle and the scapula, sometimes people mix up, but those two things, keep in mind, are part of the appendicular skeleton. And the other thing is that this pelvic bone over here, sometimes people want to put that right in the midline. So those are probably the most common areas that people kind of have little brain farts and stuff. Okay, so what we've done now is that we've covered the functions of bone. We've identified the difference between the axial and the appendicular skeleton. And again, later you will learn a bunch of those bone names specifically. And now what we want to do is we want to categorize types of bones based on shape. And so you have different bone types. And this thing right over here is called a long bone. This here is called a short bone. This is called a flat bone. And then this is an irregular bone. And finally, we have this thing called a sesamoid bone. And so these are just different bones based on shape. Now, what I want you to think about is let's try to think about, I'm going to go back a little bit and say something like simple columnar epithelial tissue versus simple squamous epithelial tissue versus simple cuboidal. Remember that we classify tissues in part based on their morphology, or epithelial tissues based in part on their morphology. So using the same kind of thinking here, what does a long bone mean? Long bone is really a shape. And I know the word, you kind of automatically want to think, well, how long does a long bone have to be? Are these bones that are longer than 4 inches or 5 inches or 6 inches? And it's not the case. Long bone here describes a shape, not actually a size. Short bone describes a shape, not a size. And again, I know when you say long and short, it makes you want to kind of pull out a ruler and measure things. But again, these are based on shape. So what is a long bone? A long bone is simply longer than it is kind of wide. Okay, similar to like a columnar epithelial cell. What is a short bone? It's about as long as it is wide. And again, that's similar to a cuboidal epithelial cell. Remember that? Those were based on shape. And so if you were to take actually the very, very tip, we can't quite zoom in here, but if you take the very tip of your pinky finger, there's a tiny little bone in there. It's actually quite small, but that is still categorized as a long bone. And the reason it's called a long bone, even though it's very small, is because of the shape of it. Okay, so we have these long bones, and then we have these short bones, and then we have flat bones, and probably the sternum is the most famous example of a flat bone. When they don't really neatly fit into any other category, we call it an irregular bone. So a vertebra is a common example. So bone shape does not fit into long, short, or flat. Now, sesamoid bones, we only have a few of these located here and there, and these are these round, flat bones. They're usually embedded within a tendon itself, and the patella is probably the most famous example of a sesamoid bone. The patella is the fancy name for the kneecap. It sits right over here, and sesamoid bones are there usually to give a little bit more leverage for muscles to work with, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the muscular system and talking about how the way that the muscles attach to bones really is going to determine how effective it is at creating some motion. Okay, so in any case, we've now identified the different types of bones based on shape. In terms of memorizing, which bones are which shape, to be honest, all I need you to know are these things over here. If the humerus is an example of a long bone, and the wrist bones and the ankle bones are examples of short bones. Sternum is a good example of a flat bone. For vertebra is an example of an irregular bone, and patella for sesamoid. This is all you need to know. What you're going to see as we get into subsequent lectures is that we're going to use long bones here as our kind of prototype bone. We're going to use long bones to talk about the functional unit of compact bone and some other details. And so we're going to visit with the long bones quite a bit more. Okay, so then our next learning objective, our last one for this video, is what are the different types of bone based on architecture, whatever that means. So here we have two architectural types of bone, and we're looking here at the skull. The skull is here, and this, if you look at this, if I were to say, if I said this whole thing is bone, of course you'd believe me. And if you look at the outer part here, if you think of this as a sandwich, this outer bread over here and this inner bread over here, you can see that that bone looks a little bit different than this bone over here. This one looks very porous. And so this over here is called spongy bone because of its architecture. This thing on the outside here is called compact bone. So both of these, compact bone and spongy bone, are made of the same stuff. And we need to talk about what that stuff is. Certainly you already know that calcium will be involved. You also know that this is connective tissue, and so maybe there's some protein fibers involved and things like that. But again, these are both made of the same stuff, but they're just arranged differently. And because they're arranged differently, that's why I use this term. Architecturally, they're different types of bone. So compact bone is where we're going to spend basically all of our time, but spongy bone, you just need to be aware that we do find pockets of spongy bone here and there. And we'll see those as we move along. All right, to recap our learning objectives, we looked at the different functions of bone, we looked at the difference between axial and appendicular skeleton, and then finally we categorized bones based on shape as well as bones based on architecture. And that'll wrap it up.